Hello everyone, this is Tom from Tutor Bros. Today we are going to learn how to derive the quadratic formula. So we start with the general form of the quadratic function, which is f of x equals ax squared plus bx plus c. Now we set it equal to 0 here because when we are deriving the quadratic formula, we are concerned with the value of x when the function is equal to 0. So that's why it's set equal to 0. After that, what we want to do is we want to subtract c on both sides of the equation so that we can eventually isolate for x by completing the square. So when we do that, we have ax squared plus bx equals negative c. Again, we're just subtracting c, the constant term, on both sides. Next thing we want to do is we want to make sure that our squared term has a coefficient of 1. So in order to do that here, we have to divide every single term in this equation by a. And then our equation will look like this. X squared plus b over a times x equals negative c over a. So again, we're just dividing everything by a. Alrighty. Now what we want to do is we want to find a term for the left-hand side of the equation that will make this a perfect square trinomial. Now how do we find out what that term is? What we do is we go to the coefficient of the linear term, in this case it's b over a, and then we divide it by 2 and square it. So if we take b over a, divide by 2, that's b over 2a, and then we square that, we'll get b squared over 4a squared. So we just want to add that to both sides of the equation, and it'll look like this. X squared plus b over ax plus b squared over 4a squared equals negative c over a plus b squared over 4a squared. So again, all we did, just added b squared over 4a squared to both sides of the equation. Alrighty, now on the left-hand side we have a perfect square trinomial. And what we want to do with that is we want to condense it into the square of a binomial. What we do then, we put a open parentheses here, we reduce x squared to just x, and then to find the second term of the binomial, we go back to the coefficient of the linear term, which is b over a, and just divide by 2. We don't square at this stage, we're just doing the dividing by 2, in which case we would get b over 2a, and then you can write it squared. So all we did was just condense the trinomial into the square of a binomial. Alrighty. Now the right-hand side of the equation, I want to clean this up a little bit, but we can't do anything with it just yet. We can't combine these terms because they do not have the same denominator. So this one has a denominator of a, this one 4a squared. The least common denominator is 4a squared, so I'm going to rewrite these terms so that they have the same denominator. So the first term will be negative 4ac over 4a squared, and then the second term will just remain the same because it already has a denominator of 4a squared. So all we did there was just rewrite it so that they have the same denominator. And then we can combine those. We'll do that on the next line here. We'll just bring down the left-hand side of the equation. Stays the same for the time being. Alrighty. And now when we rewrite this as one term, it's b squared minus 4ac. I'll put this in parentheses so there's no confusion. All over 4a squared. Okay, almost there. Now we want to take the square root of both sides of the equation. So when we do that on the left-hand side, we're just left with x plus b over 2a, not squared anymore because we took the square root. And then on the right-hand side of the equation, we take the square root of both the numerator and the denominator. Now we can't do much with the numerator in terms of taking the square root, so we're just going to write it as plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac. I'll put that in parentheses again. Now we have to put plus or minus in front of the square root because when we take the square root of something, it could either be a positive or negative square root. For example, if we have the square root of 9, it could be positive 3 or negative 3. So that's why we have to include that. Now the denominator is a little bit easier because if we take the square root of 4a squared, we can actually find that pretty easily. The square root of 4a squared is just equal to 2a. So we can just write it as 2a when we take the square root. Alrighty, last step. What we want to do here is we want to take this term, b over 2a, and subtract it to the right-hand side of the equation. Now you'll notice that b over 2a and this whole big term over here have the same denominator, namely 2a. So when we subtract it to the right-hand side of the equation, we can just write it as one whole big term. So then when we subtract it, we have x equals, and then we'll have negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac, and then put in parentheses because that's all in the numerator, over 2a. And there you have it. Here is the quadratic formula, which we have all come to know and love.